Okay, good evening everybody. Welcome along to the COSS Public Toilets webinar. Just before we get started, can I do the general check that everybody can hear us okay? Best way to do that would be just to type a yes or a thumbs up in your chat box, which is one of the dotted options on your toolbar. And I can see that you can. Fantastic, that's great. Format of tonight's webinar will be that I'm going to shortly hand over to Sandra Macaskill, who's going to take you through a brief PowerPoint presentation. We have already had some questions submitted by participants beforehand, and you will have the option after the presentation to use the Q&A box on the toolbar to submit any questions that you would like asked. So please do make use of that. I'm just going to lean over slightly and let Sandra lean in just so you can all see her.
Hello, everybody.
What we're going to do is actually turn the video camera off during the presentation, but if you would like to see Sandra as she's answering your questions, we can turn it back on. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sandra, and any questions that you have throughout the presentation, please feel free to make use of the chat or the Q&A box as well, just so you don't forget them, because I know how annoying that can be. Okie dokie, without further ado, here's Sandra.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome again to the webinar. We're hoping to just have a quick look at what's happening with public toilets in Scotland and how communities are responding to that. So first, a little bit of history to, oops, sorry, let me just get the, how do I change the?
Click in there.
Oh. First, a little bit of history in terms of public toilets. The first public toilets were actually attributed to a gentleman called George Jennings, who invented the monkey closet, which was installed at the Great Exhibition time in Crystal Palace in 1851. And it caused somewhat of a stir there, in actual fact, because they had 827,000 odd visitors who all paid 1 penny for a chance to use these toilets. For their penny, the public got a clean seat, a towel, a comb, a shoe shine, and that's where we got the lasting euphemism to spend a penny. So that's where it comes from. And it also proved to be very, very popular at the time. When the Great Exhibition ended, the toilets were moved nearby, and in actual fact they closed down, but Jennings actually managed to persuade the organisers to keep them open, and the toilets went on to earn over £1,000 a year. So for the modest cost of a penny, they caused quite a stir and also generated a bit of income as well. We'll kind of follow that through during the course of the next wee while as we take a wee whistle-stop tour of where we're at now in terms of public toilets. Just a wee aside on the history note, many of us are aware of a gentleman called Thomas Crapper, who was largely accredited with inventing the public toilet, but he was actually only about 14 years old at the time that George Jennings was working with the monkey closet, so he doesn't take the credit on this occasion. So the Victorian era then saw a rapid introduction of public toilets in town centres, parks and public areas, initially really to alleviate health problems and to address some of the issues of open sewers and some of the questionable standards of public behaviour, etc. And here there's a beautiful example of one of those public toilets which still exists today and is still operational. In fact, this can be found on Rothsay Pier. This is the gents' toilets there, and it's an absolutely gorgeous example of Victorian tile work and its lasting ability to provide an excellent service today. So public toilets then have existed on the UK high streets for more than 150 years. But the truth of the matter is that there's no legal requirement for local authorities to provide public toilets. And given the circumstances of local authority finances at the moment, there's increasing pressure to cut services. And as a result of that, toilets and toilets in public spaces in particular are being called into question and are suffering perhaps as a result of this. A Freedom of Information request in 2016 from the BBC found that nearly 2,000 facilities had been closed in the last 10 years across the United Kingdom. Now, I'm sure you've all got experiences in your own local areas of public toilets disappearing, and we'll have a look a little bit further at that in a moment. So who then provides public toilets? There's a range of different bodies who have traditionally provided toilets. The local authorities, as we've touched on. Local authorities also provide comfort schemes and community toilet schemes in addition to the actual provision of toilet facilities. And increasingly, supermarkets provide a niche in the market, train stations, bus stations, and a kind of a relatively new provider on the scene is also community groups, and hence the reason for the Community Ownership Support Service beginning to look at this topic in a little bit more detail. Now, local authorities obviously provide toilets. For example, here in Edinburgh, we know of 19 public toilets with a further 60 other toilets made accessible through council premises. And recently we've lost a significant number of those, with 10 public toilets having been closed, many of the buildings also having been sold off, so they are permanently kind of lost to the public toilet provision, if you like. In Edinburgh here we offer, the council operates a community toilet scheme, and that encourages businesses to provide access to their toilet facilities for people. Quite often the council will make a payment to businesses for this facility, usually about £500 a year, and for that they'll get some signage and they'll be encouraged to enable customers or people using their premises to access their toilets. And that takes a little bit of the pressure off the local authorities. Many of the others, local authorities actually do provide similar sorts of schemes. For example, in Highland Council, they have a huge number of toilets. Being a wide geographical area, they've got about 191 public toilets, and that costs the local authority around £1 million a year to provide. And they're currently having to look at how they can perhaps reduce some of the costs associated with that. So they're busy consulting around how that can be done at the moment. In some of the island and rural communities as well, there's increasing visitor numbers coming to those areas, putting increasing pressure on what existing toilets there are, but in some places where perhaps previously there hasn't been provision, that are issues of people having to go outdoors, as it were, or make other arrangements. And in Arran, most recently, where they've got over 1 million visitors a year, they've just stepped back from closing all 9 of their public toilets and having left 4 of them open, which is obviously proving problematic in terms of tourism. Supermarkets and train stations, bus stations are filling the gap, and as we move on to see, community groups are stepping up to the plate, as it were, as well. In the early 90s, the Royal College of Art embarked on a project to map toilets across the United Kingdom, and this project's still operational and has done an amazing job, in actual fact, documenting where public toilets can be found across the country. It's the most comprehensive index of where public toilets are and the quality of them, with, as you can see, this is a snapshot of their website, where you can actually add a toilet and put information in and talk about any toilets that have closed. You can also contribute to helping keep this project going as well. This particular project, in its comprehensive nature, has identified that for every public toilet in the United Kingdom, there are approximately 17,300 adults for every toilet that exists. Now, that amounts to a town the size of Grangemouth. So if you can imagine everybody in Grangemouth queuing up for a public toilet, that's what the number of public toilets in relation relation to our population would look like in actual fact. So that's the nature of provision at the moment. But the Great British Toilet Map is a very comprehensive sort of survey of where toilets can be found. So why then do we need public toilets? What's the rationale for them? We've heard a little bit of the history. We've heard what's happening in terms of local authorities at the moment. Public toilets are recognised globally, in fact, as a basic human right. And also in terms of health and well-being and social inclusion, we appreciate that the provision of public toilets is an essential factor of our modern lives. A further reason is that we all use public toilets several times, or we all use toilets several times a day, and to enable us to get out and about and lead the active lives that we're encouraged to do these days, we all need to have access to toilets, perhaps away from our homes as well as our workplaces. Another reason for the importance of public toilets is that there are between 3 and 6 million people recognised as having medical conditions which mean that they perhaps need access to toilets more regularly than the rest of us do. And it can be a very inhibiting factor to certainly older people or people with medical conditions not being able to access a toilet. Many will not actually leave their homes or go to places that they don't know if they haven't already checked out where they can access a decent toilet facility. Help the Aged's research identified that 80% of their respondents didn't find it easy to locate a toilet, and a further 52% found it difficult to access toilets when they were out and about. So these are significant factors which can be life-restricting for certain groups in our society, and so that's another reason why public toilets are kind of important in terms of the future face of our communities. In terms of the changing picture that we've alluded to there, some of the things that local authorities are looking to do in terms of trying to deal with their reduced budgets and their dilemma about providing access to public toilets is looking at the availability of alternatives to public toilets. We touched on comfort schemes there, but looking at making other public and commercial premises perhaps more available has been one possible route. Looking at operating hours and dates and when they're open, etc., has been another way of perhaps reducing costs, but not necessary, and trying to still maintain a service. Providing attendants to collect cash and charging for public toilets has been another approach. The comfort schemes that we've touched on. And there's been options for transfer of assets to local groups. And we'll kind of come back to that and look at some examples shortly of community groups who have in actual fact taken on public toilets for various different reasons. Other options in terms of saving on operating costs have been looking at energy saving schemes and water rationing schemes, etc., as a mechanism for enabling them, public toilets to still be provided. So these are some of the cost-cutting measures that local authorities are currently taking, and that might be familiar to many of you if you've been in discussions with your local authority about public toilet provision. And whilst we've been researching public toilet provision, we came across an example of inspiration, really, shall we say, in terms of a country that has done something really innovative when it comes to toilet provision. There was a woman called Trini Cantor-Zerlich who spoke at the conference in Arran last year, which was the Small Islands Conference looking at tourism. And she brought some inspirational images of toilet provision in rural areas. In Norway, there are some 18 national tourist routes. And what the Norwegian state has done is they've commissioned architects to design toilets in very remote rural areas, and they've created them as destinations. And here we've popped up a few photographs of some of these toilets. And if you go look at sort of the Norwegian government website, 18 national tourist routes, you can see a little bit more about this and learn about this fantastic work that's been done there. It's a little bit of inspiration for some of our rural communities here in Scotland, perhaps, who might be tearing their hair out and going, oh, we need some new toilet provision, but we don't have access to services, for example. These are in very remote rural areas without access to perhaps plumbed water and electricity. So it just goes to show that in actual fact things can be done slightly differently if we have a mind to do it. So then, what kinds of toilet provision are there? We'll have a look at that for a moment, and then we'll look at how toilets are regulated and how we have quality standards, etc. So we've touched a little bit on community toilet schemes, which are similar to organisations like Highland Council, for example, where the local authority pays businesses to cover costs of allowing their toilets to be used. It can be a cost-effective way of providing toilets, and it's very popular with local authorities. Automated toilets is another approach. Quite often we see these kind of TARDIS-like buildings in busy places. Automated public toilets, or superloos, these are referred to. They've become a popular option in local authorities, whereby they don't have to staff them. Often these will clean themselves automatically, and they can hopefully sort of prevent vandalism and antisocial behaviour, etc., so that they can be provided as self-standing units. Research, however, suggests that these are kind of not terribly popular with particularly older women, parents of young children, because they can be quite frightening. And I know myself, if I have to go to one of these, I've got to put my glasses on and read the instructions as to how to get in, etc. So they're not always as user-friendly as they might be. Direct access toilets are again similar to that, but they're perhaps provided in a whole building, whereby people can put money in a slot and use the toilet and then come back out again. These can be of different types. They can be male, female, unisex, or wheelchair accessible. And again, then we've got accessible toilets there for people with disabilities or other requirements. Another form of accessible toilet is the radar key toilet. There are some 9,000 of those around the United Kingdom, and people buy a key for £3.50, which has universal access to all these toilets. So it's a way of providing security for such provision, and that's the radar key scheme. Another form of toilet provision is changing places. About 250,000 people in the United Kingdom require larger than your average toilet to enable them to perhaps change adults with learning disabilities or profound difficulties, etc. And they need perhaps more space or a bed to be cleaned and changed, etc. And there's an increasing move towards the provision of changing places toilets. Football clubs and theme parks like Alton Towers are looking at providing those, and the Portal in Irvine, for example, has included one in its new toilet provision there. And changing -places.org website can give you some more information about that in terms of providing for that particular group within your community. A further need for toilet provision is in some of the more rural areas where there's a lot of camper vans and caravans, etc. And chemical toilet disposal has become an issue in some of those areas. With the need to empty out chemical toilets. Sometimes the chemicals actually being used can be problematic if you've got organically based toilet facilities. So there's an issue around in terms of that, and that might come up somewhat in the discussion later on. So these are different types of toilet provision. Moving on then, in terms of regulating of toilets. How are public toilets regulated? Well, we've already discussed the fact that local authorities aren't obliged to provide toilets, but for when toilets are provided, there is a British standard for the provision of toilets. That's 6465 Parts 1 and 2, and that can be accessed in the National Library of Scotland. It's been updated many times over the years, and it lays down the criteria necessary to be considered when you're placing a public toilet or when you're building a public toilet. There are standard sizes, etc., and where you would locate them, etc. And we've popped some information on that into the publication that we're producing. So that's certainly some guidelines there. Other guidelines can be found in the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995 in terms of making access to toilets for various groups with different needs, etc. And further factors that you should be considering if you are thinking about providing public toilets are baby changing facilities, hand drying facilities, female sanitary protection, disposal and dispensing, nappy dispensers, nappy disposal units, etc., and also the cleaning of public toilets. They also offer us quite a useful definition of a public toilet, should you need such a thing. A toilet that's open to the public, which is usually maintained and upheld by a local authority or other corporate body, and that could be a community group. So that's kind of broad brush strokes around the regulation of public toilets. As far as we're aware, there are no other regulations or requirements in terms of obligation to provide public toilets. Some further little bits of information about toilets here. We may wonder why we're always queuing for the toilets, particularly us women, and why that is. There's a public toilet publication produced through the Royal Academy of Arts as well, and they've done this fantastic little diagram which actually explains this in great detail as to why we need almost twice as many toilets for women as we do for men in terms of to prevent queuing. So you can see for yourself there the numbers of toilets that you might require. There's also various formula that you can have according to the numbers of people that are likely to use your toilets. So if you are planning public toilets, there are ways in which you can ensure that you are planning sufficiently for requirements in your locality. Now, the British standards also suggest if you are looking to provide toilets, that you might want to consider a public toilet strategy in your area. Your local authority may already have one, but if you are taking on the mantle of providing public toilets locally, there's certainly something that you might like to consider there. And in developing your public toilet strategy, you might want to consider things such as the number of existing facilities when they're open, how accessible they are, the features that they might have in terms of to prevent vandalism, disrepair, etc. Can people lock up their bicycles there? Can they tie their dogs up outside, etc. if they're popping in? And who's likely to use the facilities? And again, we've touched on lengths of queues. Have you got busy market days when there's likely to be more people, or you've got particular events, how you would deal with that? And what the views of male and female users might be, as well as other groups. And you might want to do some market research around requirements there, should you be planning a public toilet strategy. I'm just conscious of time here. We're moving on. We've got a couple of examples just now here of communities who have taken on public toilets and have done that in slightly different ways. For example, in Biggar, in the town in 2015, South Lanarkshire Council closed all its public toilets, and a group of businesses got together in Biggar to look to see if they could take on the public toilets. They were offered the toilets on a nominal lease, and they prepared a business plan for the toilets, and they worked out a budget of about 30k, 15k capital, 15k revenue per annum, and they made significant investment in providing, as you can see here, a lock door facility. You pay 20 pence and you get in, and the door closes behind you, and so you can then get in and access the toilets there. And so they generate income towards some of their costs there. They also have a mechanism for local businesses donating to the toilets, and they've had some grants from some of their local wind farms as well to help with some of the costs there. They employ 2 cleaners there who look after the toilets there, and they have a CCTV system which operates to ensure security there. Largely speaking, though, it's a bunch of volunteers who keep an eye on the toilets and ensure that things are kept spick and span, as we can see there. A more rural example, in 2011, RSA Community Trust took on their toilets from Highland Council there, again as part of a council's comfort scheme, and they reckoned that it was about £3,000 a year was the cost for running these toilets, which was donated to them from the council, but the actual costs were double that. So they've engaged in local fundraising there. They have donation boxes which explain the story of the toilets and the fact that it is the community that run the toilets in actual fact, not the council, so that they're encouraging people to make a contribution for using the facilities there. They have their facilities cleaned 365 days a year, and they have someone to lock and unlock them, although they are looking at a system similar to Bigger, whereby they have an automated locking system on a time clock, etc. And they have a fantastic arrangement with a company in Edinburgh which donates all their paper consumables to them. So different ways of doing things. And finally, we have Portpatrick Harbour. In 2016, the Portpatrick community took on the harbour. They bought it through community share issue and various other fundraising efforts. And as part of that, they've been redeveloping the facilities in the harbour, buying other land, creating new amenity there. And in the last year or so, Dumfries and Galloway Council closed the public toilets there with the loss of 3 jobs and the facilities, and the community have been in discussions with the council. They've come to an arrangement where the council are going to pay them £25,000 to take on the toilets, and they're securing support through their local third sector interface for other funding to enable them to refurbish the toilets, to add showers and facilities for an office for the Harbour Trust there. So that will help keep the building alive, continue to provide facilities for everybody, but also add to what's actually happening there. So there's a few examples of communities who've taken on toilets. So the real cost of spending a penny these days is more in the region of 20p to 50p, depending on where you are. And if you go to Galashiels' new toilet interchange, they have a contactless system for paying for going to the toilet. So you can get your debit card out and swipe it to go to the toilet these days. I hope that doesn't mean the costs are going to increase grossly. But that's a wee whistle-stop tour of what's happening around Scotland in terms of public toilets. So we'd be happy to hear some of your thoughts. I'm sure there's a wealth of experience out there that we can begin to share. And if there's any questions, we'll do our best to try and answer them. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandra. Whilst we reach and give everybody time to type some questions into the Q&A box, we're just going to hand back over to Sandra to answer some of the questions that we had sent through prior to the webinar taking place. I don't know, it's just easy for you just to, do you want me to read them to you? Or?
Yeah, go on. Yes,
okay.
Do, yes, you can
so question number 1, is a development trust or a board taking on a public or set of public toilets, would they be liable to pay rates on those public toilets?
I think that will largely depend on the relationship they strike with the local authorities. For example, the public toilets that we've talked of in the examples given there, it will partly depend whether or not the organisation is a charity and the relationship that you strike with your local authority. Each one of the relationships is different, and if you were going to be providing a service in lieu of the local authority, I'm sure that there could be some concessionary arrangement. Or certainly I would encourage you to explore that with your local authority as part of your arrangement. But they're all individual relationships, and each local authority is doing it differently, as it were. And each toilet, I think, it will depend on the need and how you're meeting that. But there's scope there for negotiating and coming to an arrangement with your local authority on that.
Thank you very much. One question we've had through on the Q&A is about the availability of the slides. Absolutely they will. I will circulate the slides tomorrow morning, as well as a very short survey monkey, just so we can get some feedback from yourselves as to how you found the session, and give you a chance to put forward any other suggestions that you have for future webinars. So hopefully that answers that question. Another question that we have had through is there no environmental legislation to oblige councils to make provision for the travelling public, including the tourists whom we are trying to encourage to visit Scotland? I know you previously said there was no requirement But is there any
sadly not
hidden legislation or hidden?
Sadly not. There is no legal obligation for anybody to provide public toilets, and as we've seen through the history of it, came round through the Victorian times, and I think through legislation even in cities like Edinburgh, where they were looking to clear up our act and get toilets off the street, as it were. There is nothing, which is part of the problem, leaving toilets increasingly vulnerable to being closed down or to becoming other things. Actually, there's public toilets that are becoming all sorts of different things, from fast food takeaways to posh restaurants to galleries, and I believe there's one in Primrose Hill which actually has a very high class florist as part of the offer there. So toilets are becoming all kinds of things. So maybe that's something we need to be thinking of in terms of our creativity as well, as to, is there a way, and I mean, I talked about Biggar having developed a business plan for their toilet. Now, that seems the most unlikely thing that you'd be developing a business plan for, but clearly that is an important feature of looking at something like that if you're going to take it on, because you will have costs, and how do you fund that? How do you make that work? So innovative and creative ways of looking at how you can make your toilets pay, as it were.
Absolutely. I know you had on one of your slides, you had a picture of a map showing public toilets. Will that link be available? Is that hyperlinked in the slide, Sandra?
I don't think it is, but we can certainly make sure. I can certainly give Catherine that link, and you can have a look at it. And it's certainly, I urge you to go there, because actually it's a very useful way of finding out where the toilets are across the United Kingdom, because it's kept very up to date in actual fact. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question we've had through is, how do things differ for the provision of composting toilets? Is that an area you have any expertise on?
Well, increasingly in rural areas, compost toilets are part of the offer. I think one of in the case studies we've put together, we do have an example of one on Arran, where they have a composting toilet, and I certainly know I visited one up in Eventon in the woods there. There's a big lottery funded project which has a very wonderful compost toilet. So again, there are kind of guidance on how to structure a compost toilet. And certainly in more rural areas, they are probably a more sustainable way of providing toilets, perhaps where you haven't got running water, etc. So yes, compost toilets can very much be a part of provision in rural areas. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And that was a really nice plug for the publication that I believe will be ready imminently. I'm looking around for notes. Yes, so what we'll also do for all of you guys who have attended today, we'll make that publication available. Will it be online? Yes, looking notes. So it'll be available to download online, most likely from the COSS website. So I will circulate a link to that as soon as it is ready. Mm-hmm. That takes me to the end of the questions that I've got, but I've just, my Q&A box is flashing. No problem at all. I'm glad we were able to answer that one. Just whilst I'm waffling, does anybody else have any more questions they would like to put to Sandra before we close for the evening?
Or are there any areas that we haven't covered? If you're perhaps representing an organisation or a community group, or you're perhaps in negotiations with your local authority to take on toilets, or you have no toilets, are there any questions or topics that we haven't covered in what we've looked at this evening that perhaps you think it would be helpful for us to look at and to add into the initial information that we're providing as a kind of starter for 10?
Nope, nothing else looks like it's coming through. What we'll do is, again, we'll just wait for a kind of few minutes or so, just in case anybody thinks of anything and you have a burning question you want to ask. But meantime, the slides will be circulated tomorrow, as well as the SurveyMonkey. I don't think the publication's quite ready to be issued tomorrow, but that will be a kind of supplementary email from myself. So please look out for that, and any feedback or anything at all, any comments you've got to share on this webinar or on any other suggested topics would be great and very much appreciated. If there are no further questions, I would just like to, one question's come through. Do we think groups can generate a decent revenue stream? Do you want to?
Well, in terms of revenue streams, much of the work that's been done is kind of covering the costs, because when you're running toilets, if you've got maintenance, cleaning and consumables, etc., most of the toilets that are being run at the moment are just about washing their faces. So you have to think, as we're saying, creatively about how you can do that, and are there other ways in which you can perhaps add to that, and how you can encourage people to make contributions to ensure that there are toilets there. So take it wider than just your immediate groups. If you're looking at businesses locally or events happening, how can public toilets be part of that? And certainly in terms of all the guidance on planning public toilets, it's really a public realm design issue, and we need to be thinking about it in a much bigger kind of context, rather than just we're losing our public toilets, or our public toilets are no longer fit for purpose, is often the case as well, because they were built, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. They're certainly not of the level of amenity, shall we say, that we like to experience these days when we're using public toilets. So it's about taking that wider and having a bigger conversation with people. Often talking about toilets is not something that is very
glamorous.
It's not a glamorous subject, and it's not something that people often feel comfortable about, particularly those groups who perhaps need greatest access to toilets when they're out and about, and enabling them to be out and about. So it should be a planning issue. And if you're perhaps involved in a development trust or whatever, it might be an issue that you might want to consider as you're consulting local people out and about in your area, and what your toilet provision is, and go back to having a look at some of the headings on the public toilet strategy, and how that provides for the people in your community, and whether or not there's adequate provision there. So it's something that you may proactively want to consider, as well as quite reactively, because quite often we react to the fact that we don't have toilets, or toilets are being closed. But if we look at it perhaps in a more positive way, it's a way of creating better access to revenue streams and collaboration around the funding of toilets. Hope that.
Yep, fantastic. Thank you, Sandra. Another question we've had through is relating to insurance, public liability insurance for public toilets, or other insurance requirements. Mm-hmm. Is there a broad brush approach to that, or would that be dependent on independent?
Again, you'd need to approach your insurers, and that would depend very much on your facilities and how they were staffed and supported, etc. But certainly, any of the toilets that we've mentioned would be happy to be contacted as well, and those that are referred to in the publication. So if you wanted to talk to any specific toilets about their experiences, and it might well be even worth visiting some other providers who are maybe in similar sorts of areas, or certainly having a conversation with them to see how they've gone about it, because there is a lot of experience out there in terms of a lot of learning. People haven't always got it right first time, and it's been quite challenging to get the balance right, as it were. So it is well worth having a chat with others who may be in a similar kind of position.
Brilliant. That's also a really good plug for the Community Learning Exchange Fund that can be used to do just that, go and visit other those who are providing public access to toilets. Further details can be made available through Community Ownership Support Service web advisors. Please just drop them an email. One other question we've had through is, do we have any examples of where public bodies have worked with a Bailey or ScotRail to provide facilities on public land around stations? That's quite a specific question. That might need to be one that we go away and ask.
It's an interesting one, actually, because I'm actually just talking to ScotRail about such a thing at the moment. On the Borders railway line, the various station buildings down the railway line are being developed at this moment in time, in conjunction with Network Rail actually owns the buildings, but ScotRail Abellio actually has the tenancy of a lot of the buildings there. And interestingly, they are in the process of leasing a lot of them to community groups to run facilities, many of which will include public toilets as part of the offer there. I mentioned the Galashiels interchange, where you can do your contactless fee paying for your access to the toilet there. They have a kind of bespoke building there which does include toilets, but all the other toilets down that line are currently being looked at, most with community groups, to encourage them to have toilet facilities as part of the offer there. So that is a very ongoing and live issue, certainly on the Borders Railway line, because of it's the newest one, shall we say.
Who knew? Fantastic. Well, we have had no further questions sent through, so I think that takes me to a nice point to wrap things up. So thank you very much, Sandra, on behalf of everybody here, for coming in and giving up your time to do this. And just one final plug for the publication. Please do look out for it. We will be sending it through to everybody, and anybody with any questions that we haven't been able to take on or answer tonight that come to you after the session, please feel free just to fire them over to us and we'll get those answered as quickly as possible. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time, and we'll hopefully see you at a webinar again soon.